and welcome to Sustain, the podcast where we talk about sustaining open source for the long haul. Who are we? Where do we come from? Where are we going? There's just something really nice about living near the ocean and seeing the different moods of the ocean every morning. It's new to me, and the waves are just magnificent. I know that's not what I normally say at the beginning of these things, but it's just really pleasant. So I'm going to be looking at the ocean for most of this podcast. Hello, everyone. Really excited to talk to our guest today. Before I introduce our guest, I want to make sure you know who I am, this weird person who's going on long tangents. I am Richard Littauer. I'm your host. Really excited. And I'm joined today by B. Dougie, or Brian Douglas, as he's sometimes otherwise known, joining us from Oakland, California. Brian, how are you doing today?
I am doing fantastic. I don't have an ocean view. I've got my back patio view, and it's cloudy today, so not much to look at.
Well, if you ever want to have an ocean view, I've recently moved to Wellington, New Zealand. I think it's the first time I've said this on this podcast, and everyone is pretty much welcome. Just get in touch. I have an extra bedroom on purpose, and the waves are quite lovely. But that's not what we're here to talk about. This is not the surfing podcast, as much as that would be awesome. We are here to talk about open source and how awesome it is. Today, we're here to learn about open source and how awesome that is. Brian Douglas is the founder and CEO of Open Source, where he works on increasing the knowledge and insights of open source communities. In the past, he's led a developer advocacy at GitHub by fostering a community of early adopters through conversations with the top open source maintainers there. So he's not a newcomer to open source, been around for a while. B. Dougie, when I talk to people who've worked at GitHub in such a thing as developer advocacy, I'm never quite sure. Do you identify as a developer first, or as a developer advocate, or project manager, or some sort of non-technical person? What's your story? Where'd you come from?
At GitHub, I was a developer advocate, and on paper, I was the first advocate at GitHub. 2018 is when I joined. And GitHub's been like always, folks just knew what they were building 2008 till 2018 before I got there. So everyone was an advocate. And it got to the point where people would just travel all around the world on GitHub's dime. So that kind of ran it in. So that's why I joined and officially supported things like GraphQL and GitHub Actions and Codespaces, eventually Copilot. But yeah, before that, I was actually a developer full-time, worked at startups. So I also worked at Netlify, where I came up with the concept of open source. And the idea was I kept doing open source contributions, needed to maintain my PRs and like a dashboard, a CRM, if you will. And I built this little dashboard on top of the GitHub GraphQL API called Open Source. And yeah, that's to answer your question. I could go even deeper in the story, but like I'll leave it at that.
No, that's great. Yeah. So you're a developer. You've been around. Early days, Netlify must have been super fun. Early days, GitHub flying around sounds like a lot of fun. Open source just sounds incredibly boring. It wasn't well named. I don't know if anyone's told you that. No, it's great. Tell me about what the dashboard showcases about your open source projects and communities.
Yeah, and it'd make it even more interesting. OpenSauce.pizza is the URL. And that was literally the URL I got in 2017 when I was working at Netlify. Pete.pizza came out. I just wanted to have something memorable and kind of stuck. The website today, I don't know if we'll change it by the time this goes out, but like it says build successful open source projects. And the dashboard itself just provides essentially what the GitHub Insights tab on your repository gives you. We're providing a plus to that. So if you wanted like more details and insights on the folks contributing, your OSSF scorecard, et cetera, we've got that in our repo pages, essentially. And then we have the ability to have a workspace, which is a lot of folks don't work on one project. A lot of people work on entire organizations of projects, or you work on something that's your full-time job as an open source maintainer. What if you can break the sort of wall of orgs and throw all stuff that you're interested in to a custom workspace? And we call these data sets because we do like a little AI thing with it. But the goal is really, I'm in charge of this organization's repos, these 5, and then 3 over here. And then also I touch these things on the weekend. Let me just put it all in one place so I can see where activity and high level PR velocity, et cetera, is. So that's what you do today with open source, see a lot of data. And then the goal is to turn those into actionable insights.
Okay, before we get started into really understanding all that, what's the payment model? How do you keep yourself sustainable?
Today, VC money. That's the quick answer. So we built a product that people enjoy and use for free. The sustainable model, so we do have a SaaS experience, and I'll be quite upfront. What we're finding is like folks will use it for free. We just don't want to charge people $20 a month, $100 a month. So we've been focused on OSPOs and enterprises and larger organizations that have a larger pain point on trying to get observability or orchestrate developers within open source at a larger scale. So that's been our focus in the last 18 months. At this point, almost 2 years we've been working on this, but we didn't figure that out until 18 months ago.
When you say we, how many people are working on open source?
Including myself, eight folks.
Wow, that's a lot. Cool. Are you still on seed? Are you on A?
Seed. So I worked at GitHub and developer advocacy, got to like help promote a bunch of really cool features, engage open source maintainers. So I worked pretty closely with Nat Friedman, the CEO, on certain engagements. And he came on as a cap table as an angel. Him and about 15 other folks ended up collectively giving me $1 million to start this company. So left GitHub for about 12 months until we raise what we call our seed at this point, and from Bold Start Ventures and from GitHub.
When your boss pays you $1 million to leave the company, doesn't that just feel weird at some point?
Technically, he was my skip level, but he already left the company.
Cool.
So at the point I reached out to him, he had left 6 months prior. So it felt worth reaching out to him and saying, hey, I'm thinking about building a thing. What are your thoughts, feedback? Also, please money.
Interesting. What's the long-term sustainability plan that you were able to pitch investors on? Is it pitching to large multinational corporations to figure out their open source dashboards?
It's that. And we had to figure out, what are we trying to do? So first step was, can we encourage people to do open source? How can you see what you're working on? My pain point, which is I want to see all my PRs in one place. And that was a quick, yeah, we could do that. That's something that's a trivial thing. It's a weekend project with the API. But then we found, okay, well, who cares? So we want to talk to companies, because if companies valued that information, were they willing to pay for it? And during that sort of explorations, the story is out there actually on the YouTube channel. I never actually said who the company was, but I'll say the company is Stripe. And it was about the idea of lottery factor. And we found one SDK that had one contributor in the last 6 months. That one SDK did X amount of business for the company per year. So X amount as in like, not quite $1 billion, but like it was up there. So that's how much money was going through this one SDK. And when you talk about sustainability, like that's not sustainable. It happened to be the Django SDK. So then the question is, how do we encourage more contribution and excitement and make sure that this thing doesn't go away one day? And this is corporate investment. We've got this thing that's driving revenue for us, but what happened? Where did the ball drop? And that's the story that we started telling. And then we also found not only Stripe, I sort of expanded into what I call like institutional finance. So like there's this foundation called FinOps, and spoke at their conference last year. And they also have the same thing, which they just want to be able to maintain who signed the CLA and who's like approved of doing open source. I can't remember if you had Chad Whitaker on this podcast as a recent.
Many times. He actually helped found it.
Okay, that makes sense. So I talked to him recently, and they're doing like the FOSS Funders, OSS Pledge, but getting funding into open source, it's a good first step. I think we've all validated that's a thing. But once you give the funding, or once you identify the projects that can take the funding, consume it, because this is going to be impactful to roadmaps and sustainability, then what? How do you tell the story of what happens after you've taken the funding? We kept going up and higher, eventually enterprise level, to find out like this is actually a pretty strong pain point. And once you get that far removed, this could be super impactful. So if Microsoft has recently donated, was it $2,000, so 150 projects through some of the stuff that Chad's been working on, that's super impactful. But like, how do you even know where to start? What projects are going to get that $2,000? And usually it's put your finger in the air. It's like, oh, well, hey, you're close by. Would you like $2,000? And I know it's a little bit more than that. I'd love to talk to that team and find out more of that story. But what we're trying to do is paint the picture of, okay, what is the actionable insights in open source? And do these move when we get $2,000 of funding? Or does it move when now the entire company is focused on shifting their entire focus on performance to Rust, and now they're involved in the Rust ecosystems? Where's the impact? How does that sort of fan out? And I think if we could start with the top and get enterprises excited about this, again, shout out to Chad for doing the sponsorship side, and a few other folks are doing this as well. But what about the sustainability of, I have resources I can put on issues that are opened, that can attack the roadmap, can make influence and like set up reviews for new features? I can go on a long tangent on this one point, but I remember sitting at GitHub, we had to decide top 100 open source projects, which I can go into details on how we did that in a sec. But I remember talking to Evan Yu, because he's part of the top 100, Evan Yu from Vue.js. And I remember when Vue 3 came out, request for commits, everyone has something to complain about, but no one's willing to review literally Vue 3 and say, I'm going to use this at work and tell you if it works or if it breaks. Everyone can complain, but very few people will actually go impact the roadmap by testing it live in production for the company. Granted, like there are folks who are doing that, but we need way more people just using the next level tech. I talked to TC39 with Moment.js. was being deprecated. And then we now have this primitive time thing. I forgot what it's called, but everyone complains about Moment.js being too big. Node.js provides a new solution that's now in the polyfills, basically the testing phase, but very few people are using it and testing inside their corporate projects. And that's what we need more of that. So we're really focused on an open source is like if we could tell stories around who's contributing, where they're coming from, what companies are represented, what status of the projects are, whether they're secure, compliant, whether they have a high lottery factor or a low lottery factor, things like confidence being the ability of like you interact with the repo, what's the chance of you making a contribution, which is not good or bad, but understanding if I can make a contribution as an outsider from a company or I can't, that helps dictate, okay, what is the move forward and how do we like continue to sustain these projects?
There's so much to talk about in that.
Yeah, apologies. That was a ramble. Yeah.
It's all right. First off, I want to give a shout out to Chad. He's awesome. Chad's going to come on this podcast soon to talk about fair open source or fair source, which is a new initiative of his, which is pretty exciting. So keep your ears out for that, people. Also, if you want to hear more about FOSS Funders, go to fossfunders.com. What's interesting about FOSS Funders is that you can add any company that has a policy around open source funding. And if there's a public thing to point to, you can have their logo be added there as these are people who fund open source. And you'll see way down at number 7 on the left column there out of 14 people, there's this company called Maintainer Mountaineer. Long-time listeners of this podcast will know that was my company. I started back in 2018 or something, building dashboards for ecosystems of open source for corporate open source companies that didn't know what was going on and didn't know who was contributing and tried to tell stories of using metrics about what's happening with their open source world. So a lot of this conversation is very interesting to me, having been exactly in your shoes.
Wow.
It's just fascinating. And I mentioned FOSS Funders because if your company has a blog post, go add it. Just make a PR, add it. That'd be super dope. Maintainer is barely even alive anymore, and I have a policy, so I just put it up there. But what I failed at, which I think is the stuff I really want to get to, is it's very difficult to tell stories about open source contributions as an external person coming in and looking at a different company and a different ecosystem without spending all of your time on the ground with the engineers, looking at issues and looking at users and figuring out how they contribute and what their level of power is in the community and so on. How do you do that at open source? How do you successfully tell stories about people who you don't know?
I will fully admit today, we can't be an expert at every language, framework, every project. But what we've really been trying to do is start talking to folks before we ship any code. So when I told you I took a basically angel round to start this company when I left GitHub, before taking a salary, I bought cameras. And the reason for that is I like doing podcasts. I like talking to folks. My job at GitHub was to meet with open source maintainers. Actually, Abby's the person who invited me to come on this podcast or give me the link to book this is Abby. And she works on the open source team and works with maintainers. So I helped kickstart that engagement. And the way we started this is we looked through top open source maintainers based on unique issue authors. Issue authors is better than looking at stars. This is a bit of the secret sauce that GitHub uses and how we did top 100 projects. Because stars, you're like, number 56 on the list is jQuery. And it's a great project. I kickstarted my career.
Awesome project. Awesome. Yeah.
They cut a release actually early this year, but it's been years before the previous release. So if you rank based on stars, it's not a great place to start. If you rank based on like issue count, not a great place. If you look at Godot has 5,600 issues because their customer support happens through GitHub issues. That's open source game engine. And then look at PRs. Some teams have PRs that sit for a long time. Some teams don't. If you just start counting numbers for the sake of counting numbers, it's not going to work. Count contributors, not going to work. But when you look at unique issue authors and then take that unique issue authors of outside contributors opening issues, but then we start really slicing that down of company representation of issues being opened, now you already have a story. It's hard because so many people come before us and built stuff that like either gamifies open source or adds metrics that don't mean anything or like focus on the wrong thing. And like, I want to be very clear, like we might be working on the wrong stuff. That's why we want feedback. So I have this podcast. It's called The Secret Sauce. And the secret sauce is folks who are successful in open source, or I observe that they're successful, whether it's a company backed or just a stakeholder. And we have 30 to 45 minute conversations really talking about what's their secret sauce. And some things that I learned was from Brendan Burns, who co-created Kubernetes at Google. When I explained with the unique issue authors, that's literally what they did at Google. They found that Red Hat was active in their participation in issues. It caused them to reach out to Red Hat and say, Red Hat, what's going on? It seems like you're interested in what we built, this little rinky thing to orchestrate our stuff. How can we help? And then that was able to get them the green light and the blessing from Red Hat to say, oh, in Linux distros, use Kubernetes for orchestrating your servers and et cetera. We're really, really trying to attach into success and storytelling things like a lottery factor. So like the chaos project metric, actually they changed the name to something else. I always forget what they changed it to, but if 2 or more people are doing 50% of the contributions, there's a high lottery factor. And if you win the lottery, the chances of you coming back to contribute is pretty low. Your project could be at risk if only 2 people are pushing the majority of the code base. Now, there's a lot more
contributor absence factor. I went and looked it up. I killed lottery factor, and I'm sorry about that. If you go look at the original thread, I pointed out that lottery factor was a really bad name because lotteries are really bad things. It is much harder to remember contributor absence factor.
It is, the absence of a catchy name. Yeah. Side note, I went to school because of the lottery. Bright Futures in Florida. Yeah, so percentage of everything that's played in the Florida lottery goes to underrepresented folks. In high school, if you have good grades, you get your school paid for. So I don't advocate for gambling. And I actually remember that thread. I didn't remember your name being in there, but I remember that thread. So 100%, there's going to be a problematic name for stuff. But going back to my original point, having a story behind the lottery factor or the contributor absence, if you look at a project like Pgvector, I don't know if you're familiar with Pgvector, it's Postgres. You build embeddings to do some AI stuff on top of your Postgres database. That was created by Andrew Kane. Andrew Kane is an early employee at Instacart. So he was successful in the IPO, but he created this Pgvector as a sort of thing he's doing because he's got a lot of free time. A lot of contributions are powered by Andrew Kane. A lot of those contributions are not backed by PRs. They're backed by commits that sometimes have issues attached. So that has a super high lottery factor where the dude actually did kind of win the lottery through the IPO. But what I'm getting at is it's a good thing to know. If you're building your entire project and your roadmap and you're sustaining the future of your company or open source on top of something, at least know what the story is. And the thing that we always go back and forth on is lottery factor. Like, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Because some projects, it's fine with lottery, like with the only 2 people maintaining the thing. But then when you start literally counting the companies, the Chaos project has this elephant ratio. So like large companies involved in the project is also another great metric for sustainability. I guess if I can say anything that's quotable is you can't look at one metric and make a judgment on the sustainability of a project. What we're trying to provide is enough insight so you can pick and choose. Eventually, you'll pick and choose what should be shown in your dashboard and what should be important. But today, we're about 13,000 folks using the platform. We're still a drop in the bucket when it comes to like the majority of open source and what we can impact them.
13,000 is still pretty good. And that does raise another question for me. GitHub is not open source. It's the largest repository for open source repositories, but it's not the only one. And so I'm curious, does OpenSauce entirely use GraphQL from GitHub, or does it also say use GitLab or things that aren't hosted on major instances?
The first 12 months, we actually focus on how we source the data. This is a question I wanted to preemptively focus on out the gate because I worked at GitHub. I know what rate limiting looks like at GitHub. I know we can't go API only. So we're not using API only. So instead, and we've done a couple of blog posts on there. There's one around how we did embeddings and built our AI feature for fun back in April called Star Search. So the way we approach this is we're looking at the GitHub event feed. And that's how we sort of built our own GitHub archive in particular. So to answer your question of what about everything that's not on GitHub, we built something called the pizza oven, which is Git-based. Basically, you bake the repo and it turns out insights, which is like the open source pizza pun there. We could hypothetically work with the GitLab event feed, which they have a very similar experience. We could also go bake a GitLab repo because our eventual goal is, can we provide the same actionable insights for enterprise behind a firewall? Because we want to make sure that it works internally for inner source as well as it works for open source. So to answer your question, hypothetically, yes, we can grab insights or data from other places. Today, we're heavily focused on GitHub, mainly because of our small usage today. If we had a bazillion people using this, we're probably going to end up getting some non-GitHub hosted projects that are interested in working with us. And we'd love to have that conversation. We've had a couple of those conversations, but it really comes down to like, do you have time to work with us and help us scope out how to build this? And basically, it's been no. People don't have the bandwidth today to work with us because we're still small. So it's better to make the bigger splash in projects and organically already have the data waiting for them when they sign up.
You mentioned an interesting word there. I guess it's a compound word, inner source. So there's inner source commons, and there's this whole idea of taking open source practices and using them inside of a very large company so multiple teams can work together and use the best of both worlds. Now, as an open source consultancy, it makes sense to me that you're thinking about inner source because it's an obvious moneymaker. How do people working inside the company? The main question I have for you is that this is where I fell into with one of my clients for a maintainer. How do you avoid becoming a jumped up technical project manager for an internal company and having that direct your funding and your energy? How do you avoid inner source being a hole into which you fall? It's not a bad hole. It's just a very clear, actionable, we can make money there, and then we're not doing open source anymore.
I don't have a good answer for that. If I had large enterprise come to me and say, hey, we're ready to go, we're going to have you focus on building this thing and extend resources. Yeah, sure, let's go. But I think the way we approach this open source first is that, can we just have the common language? And I think we talk about like developer metrics. How does this not divulge into like counting PRs per week or counting a bunch of stuff that doesn't actually matter? And there's like always going to be a story of, oh, I only did one PR because I was mentoring junior engineers for the whole summer. That never comes up in context of those developer DORA metrics experiences. So we clearly want to show that open source has a pathway to sustainability, this governance. We've got these Linux Foundation, we've got the CNCF that have good structure and influence. But then you go to like the OpenJS, they have a structure, I guess. I could probably eat those words.
Sorry, I just sort of shook my head on the camera being like, do they? But yeah.
Yeah, it's all questionable. At least we, as small JavaScript projects, we have somebody to look up to. We're like, hey, has anybody ever solved a problem? Like, how do we entertain enterprise usage for our small, like community run project? A lot of times projects will find themselves in a foundation, find themselves with large adoption or investment from companies. But what do you do with that? And the hope is that we can stay true to our guns and like have a open source journey that shows actionable insights that then also marry over into inner source or enterprise companies can tell a story of, I've got 65 different organizations that are all closed source, a bunch of different teams that are like, some stuff's dead projects. There's like this project graveyard that happens in GitHub. How do we even know where to start? How do we know, like, is this actively used and maintained and et cetera? In that story, there's a pathway through open source. Use that same storytelling ability for private and enterprise. So maybe some enterprises listen to this and they're like, hey, cool, we're ready to pay you lots of money. And I'm like, cool, like let's start with the smallest thing possible so we can just at least start in the pathway of a relationship. But I think my early days at Netlify, we had the same problem where we had a very large customer who was going to give us, I think, 8 figures worth of business. And then it would have took the entire team in a whole other path. And the benefit is the Netlify founders has come on board as one of my angels. So I get to talk to folks who have been really strong mentors in my career to ask these questions. Okay, well, how do we like make this so we don't kill the company by like chasing, let's say, Google, because Google's got Google problems. And now we got to like focus on Google for the next 2 years. And then we have to ignore everyone else. And the answer is this smallest piece of the pie. We can promise a long relationship, but like we only need this amount to sustain the business and scale. And then we could prove that same little small piece with another customer as we build to the roadmap. Because what we're building has, and I'm surprised to hear about the Mountaineer company that you're working on. I find there's a lot of folks, I just wasn't aware of it, but I find there's a lot of people who have approached this problem from all different angles. And I think a lot more folks are like focused on like the sustainability through sponsorship, TideLift, Open Collective, Thanks.dev, Polo.sh. And I've been very clear like in how I've approached this and storytelling and like even hanging out with those founders. I think the sustainability through funding, that's very important. But what about proving the funding matters, proving what happens with the funding? And that's the thing we've always wanted to approach. When I was at GitHub, we had to get funding. We wanted to rebuild the GraphQL API or refocus on GitHub Marketplace. So you have to get funding from the higher ups to say, there's a business here. There's a reason why we should put a team on this. Here's a justification. Here's a design doc. Here's how we'd like scale resources and then hopefully bring in sales team to add this to their portfolio for selling. It's the same reason for open source. Take a step back. I was sitting in the Secret Sauce podcast with Kelsey Hightower. Sounds like a weird flex, but Kelsey's a great dude. If he hadn't been in this podcast, he'd be a great guest as well. But he was talking about the world of Linux starting as an open source, a great team, a great foundation, always never going to be a profitable business. It's just focused on supporting open source and building things. Today, if you start a project that's open source through and through, side project, you're just going to work on it, take money just through donations. There's a world where that never actually is successful. And the real answer is open source projects will eventually take VC money, or open source projects will scale a business. That's the thing that we have to constantly ask that question is like, so Pgvector is now a side project for somebody who has got a lot of free time. Companies are contributing to it. Neon databases made a ton of performance improvements on that based on the data I'm looking at. And that might forever stay a side project or a fun open source thing that you can see the data. There's no company backing. Companies will be involved. Or we could wake up one day and Pgvector has raised a $100 million round. What does that mean for everyone who's invested in like their entire roadmap and future is built on this thing? Who knows? But until we like answer that question of can I sustain an entire project and it get really popular and Microsoft has it embedded in all of Azure and it still is okay to have a handful of maintainers contributing to it and not be super questionable. And like we now have this XC vulnerability thing that happened earlier this year, another Postgres extension. We only get to that point when it becomes what was it? The disclosure, it was in partnership with the FBI. There was a blog post and it was about high reach, low visibility. And like XE is a high reach, low visibility project. Pgvector, high reach, low visibility. No one knows who Andrew Kane is. So that means it's opportunity for security or basically for bad actors to slip in there and be like, hey, for the next 2 years, I'm going to become best friends with you and get access as maintainer and then take it over and change emails. And that becomes very clearly a sustainability problem. So then the answer is like, does Microsoft take over all that stuff and like absorb it into their Borg, which is Azure, or the CNCF absorbs it and then it becomes like a standard project? Who knows? We're actively living this. We're watching it so close that one day we'll take a step back and be like, oh, we should have saw this coming.
I love the Borg metaphor for Linux Foundation. I have never thought of that before. I just really like that. I will never get a job at Linux Foundation with some of the things I say about them, but that's okay with me. I just saying that's a really interesting analogy. So, Ryan, I have a question that's coming up to my mind. Not every open source project is going to get $100 million. It's just not possible. Not every open source project wants to. A lot of maintainers don't have the type of connections that enable access to large amounts of funds. I would say the vast majority of maintainers, the long tail, right? And most open source will die just without a lot of money. It's all passion projects. There is a graveyard on GitHub and elsewhere. Sometimes people tinker with it, but in general, that's just not how open source works. Open source helps you see your dashboard of what's going on in your world, your PRs, etc. What are you doing to ensure that funds and energy percolate down the stack? How are you supporting the long tail of open source as opposed to looking for the next $100 million closure round or something?
I had a fever dream, literally. I had COVID 3 weeks ago. And I was
sorry, man. Ouch.
Yeah. I'm one of those that got all the shots and never had COVID until this current vibe that's happening. So I guess it was coming, basically, but pretty mild. But because I needed to stay inside, because that's what you should do with COVID, folks, I ended up watching this TV show. I'm going to answer this question in a story, but I watched this documentary called Welcome to Wrexham, which is based on the football club in Wales, specifically the city of Wrexham, purchased by Ryan Reynolds and his friend, the guy from Always Sunny in Philadelphia. And 3 seasons, everyone's been saying, watch this thing. I'm going to watch it. And I ended up watching 3 seasons in 2 days, inspired. And this was
Brooklyn Nine-Nine for me. Last time I got COVID, that was it for the whole week. I'm not sorry.
All right. Brooklyn Nine-Nine's been on my list for a long time. I've only seen like a couple episodes. But to answer your question, basically football club in the UK, it's got English, soccer, ESL. I don't know what the acronym is, but you've got the Premier Leagues at the top. You've got the Champion League on the next tier. Then you've got another league and another league below. And then you got the National League. It's where Wrexham started. And the goal was always to go up the chain. And when it comes to open source, not everyone's going to be Linux Foundation backed project or sponsored by Microsoft. But if you could aspire to like look up the chains, the way I've explained this to my team internally, I haven't written this out or shared this before, but if you're an individual contributor and you want to get involved in open source, go look at maintainers, find out what they're doing, and like do what they're doing. If they're like showing up this and they're answering questions, I honestly would not be here without mentorship. If it wasn't for the open source contribution I made for the very first Node project I ever tried to install that I couldn't, emailing the maintainer and then him emailing me back answers on how to run the Harmony flag in Node.js back in 2015, I wouldn't be where I am today. So going to a maintainer and saying, hey, what can I do to be helpful? What can I do to like help sustain a project? That's really the goal. Even if you never be a maintainer, if you can just know what it is or what it's like to be a maintainer, you've got a goal for advancing up the stack. And if you're a maintainer and you're like, hey, I'd love for my project to be a little more successful, look at companies. Now, not every maintainer or open source project has to be a company, but if you look at the sort of governance and the structure of like how you structure teams and how people focus on different things, it mimics what companies are doing. And if you look at companies, you look at enterprises. So again, Premier League, Championship League, you're looking at enterprise. You don't have to be an enterprise, but if you're a company, you see an enterprise, oh, wow, they have got this whole division for doing X, Y, Z. And like they update shareholders on a regular basis, which if you're not updating your GitHub sponsors or your Tidelift supporters on a regular basis, you're missing an opportunity. And there's always a structure of how I could learn from the larger tier. So with open source, what we're really trying to do is pull people up the chain. If you could be a maintainer and you have the aptitude and you have the interest, you could find other maintainers to help co-locate your contributions alongside of them. If you're a company and you need sustainability and you need sponsorship, the hope is that we can show you the companies that are actively participating in open source. And now you know exactly what companies to hang out with. One of my first engineers at open source, he maintains a project called NGRX. And Google has been a heavy user, consumer of his project. But it was years before he found that out. It was actually, he went to a Google event and someone's like, hey, we use NGRX. But he went years without even knowing that. And I think it's always a big miss of, oh, wow, big company's been using me for years. I've been just doing side sustaining like contribution. And I could have like turned on the GitHub sponsors and asked them, hey, can you just tell me what you wanted me to work on? Give me like a one-time donation. It'd be super helpful to get me to focus on this. But always, we don't know how to get to that point, how to like step through that. And I think what I found out with hosting a podcast called The Secret Sauce is that it really turns out that's really the path that everyone's been going. I've been working on this for years. I thought maybe I'd go to a foundation or try a company. So I joined the GitHub Accelerator and decided I didn't want to do it either, but I got to learn how to run a proper project. Evan Yu's journey is he built Vue. It's a sustainable project. It's definitely like a lifestyle, takes sponsorship. But then he's got this Vite thing that's very clearly embedded in all of the front end engineering ecosystem. That's the thing that he's now starting to scale out and like have proper governance and structure with folks with company involvement. And that's another story I chatted with him on. But I don't know if they answer your question, but
yeah, it's an answer to the question. I don't like it. And that's okay. I'm opinionated and I'm often wrong. So
I love this conversation. So I'm happy to hear your feedback.
Well, so looking up the chain, to me, it sounded very similar. And I'm not judging you personally. I'm just thinking about the way it sounded to me and what came up to something like a pyramid scheme or something like we all invest in Bitcoin, all things rise, or even worse. Well, I don't want to use that metaphor, but let's say academia, right? The way to get better is to look at professors and see what they're doing and then go up and get tenure. The problem with that is that there are systemic issues with academia. Not everyone can get tenure. Not everyone can get $1 million of VC money. There are so many packages on NPM that would just bankrupt the earth several times over. And so what I'm thinking that looking up the chain and looking up at larger corporate companies and seeing what they do, et cetera, works really well for a single view of what open source is. But it doesn't open up a diversity of opinion for how governance ought to work. It sidesteps the foundation model. It sidesteps the kind of model where someone who doesn't have any goal to grow financially beyond maybe enough to feed their family and nothing else. They don't want to get bigger. And also, your question didn't answer, what are you doing to help out people who are your dependencies with open source? How do you circulate the money down as opposed to always looking up and always trying to fund your own thing? So could you speak more to that?
Yeah, I appreciate the clarification too as well, because perhaps this is my naivete as well, because I always feel like I'm an outsider. So I'm coming as an outsider, as not mainly maintaining a large project, but just being participating in those. So I can go back and forth on that, but let's focus on the like, how do we go down the chain? Yeah. Actually, I don't think I even said this. It's an education thing. If you don't know, I have a finance degree. I got it in 2008, the worst time to ever get a finance degree. I have a finance degree because I didn't have money growing up.
You learned a lot real quick. I'm just saying,
exactly.
Like, that's a good time to learn a lot. So
I did learn a lot. I'm the best with my taxes and with my investments because of that degree. But I got that degree because what I saw as possible is I got college paid for thanks to the lottery. So I'm going to pick a degree that's going to learn how to make money, and that's finance. Wrong time, wrong place, but I got the degree. The degree turned into me getting a sales role. I did my job with my eyes closed because I got to automate it because I was a copy and paster like left and right. And I got to automate myself into a couple of promotions. So basically that's part of my journey, but to go support down the chain, like we've shipped and this is no perfect answer, the concept of SBOM. And the SBOM, you can get a software bill of materials. And I know that's a meme within the space, just like Linux Foundation is, and just like all this other stuff is. But if you could see what your project is dependent on, at least most of what it's dependent on, then you could see where impact and where there's opportunity for either donations or for contribution, or just see what's out there. In open source in particular, we ship this, but we don't have like a story that we shipped yet with it because we're trying to figure out what the world looks like with this in it. We have workspaces. You can drop an SBOM based on your list of dependencies into a workspace. So you can see scorecards, you can see Oscar ratings, you can see contributors, all based on that SBOM. And then the hope is that now you have an idea of where the light touches, if you like lighting. Cool. And then you can make a judgment on that. So we haven't actually got the next step, but I think a lot of folks already have started the SBOM story and journey to understand what is down the chain and what's exposed or what's not secure or what needs some extra attention. And I think it's not a perfect answer because SBOMs fall apart for transient dependencies like in NPM. You've got stuff that are like super like the left hat. You got stuff like that it'll show up everywhere. So then does everyone sponsor left hat? And left hat's just an example, but like you could think of core.js or anything like that. So it's not a perfect answer, but I think what it really comes down to is you don't know what you don't know. I have a finance degree because I didn't know I could get a job writing code full time. I had to find myself in a position where I could copy and paste myself to get promoted twice in a year to senior IT sales, selling Wi-Fi to NFL stadiums. So at that point, I was like, where else do I go? Going to be a manager or traveling salesman? Or my little weekend project, I could just go find a job doing that full time. And that's what I did because I don't want to do sales anymore. So if podcasts like this, conversations like this is what really gets people the exposure that's needed. When I talk about enterprise going up that chain, it's not really about the necessity to make it to the next level. It's the necessity of like democratizing information. If governance or foundations, again, I started open source. I didn't know foundations existed. So then I stumbled into this really at GitHub only like 5 years ago is when I knew what a foundation was. I know we could talk about Linus Torvalds or like all these other godfathers of open source, but for me, as a Black man in America who learned how to code from Googling Ruby on Rails tutorials, I don't know who those people are. I don't fanboy any of those people when I meet them because I'm weird flex, but it's because I didn't grow up as those people to look for or to even understand that they're important people I should like pay attention to. So I think what it really comes down to, like, we just have to provide a path, and I could show you 100 people coming out of HBCUs in Atlanta and North Carolina that would love to participate in the ecosystem, get a job somewhere that will take their skills. Because one of the hardest time right now is to get a job since the .com bubble, even with college grads. And what I've always wanted to do with open source is be a platform to level people up and this really just build out that awareness. But what we ended up finding, we have to actually start from the top because the top is where the money is. It's not trickle down economics because we can go back and forth on that too as well. But it's really, can we just tell a story where folks can be educated or just drive more awareness around the idea of open source and where you fit as sustaining that?
I think that's a laudable goal. And I think it makes more sense now where you're coming from and what you're trying to do. So thank you for sharing that. I wasn't trying to piss on the idea of your project. I was just pointing out that always looking up is tough. But for a person coming from an HBCU, for a person coming from someplace like Nigeria, sometimes just getting a job in open source is awesome. And that's all you need. That is so cool. And I'm totally in favor of that. I'm in favor of lifting up people from different backgrounds. I also grew up very poor. I have different levels of privilege for other reasons. Don't go do an ancient Greek degree at university, kids. Do something else. But yeah, I hear that. That is awesome. I wish you the best of luck. We are running up on time. So I want to make sure that we wrap up and just allow you to get back to building the awesome tools that you are building. People can find you at opensauce.pizza. Where can people find you personally on the web?
So OSS.fyi/bdougie. That'll take you to my open source profile. But I'm bdougie everywhere on the internet. So Twitter, bdougieyo on Twitter, but everywhere else is bdougie. So I answer DMs and always happy to have a conversation with folks.
That's BDOUGGY.
BDOUGIE. So like,
thank you
just
so
like
much.
Dougie Fresh. Dougie Fresh is a rapper from the late 80s and spelled the same way.
Well, thank you so much. Don't leave yet, though. At the end of every podcast, we have Spotlight. It's the part of the show where we highlight other people, projects, or things that have helped us out in our lives, and we just think they should have some light shed on them. Today, I just want to spotlight Mr. Carreras. None of you have heard of Mr. Carreras, but he was one of the first people I met who was from a very different background than I was. He was just a Hispanic guy working at the school that I was at who taught music. He was my direct advisor when I was in middle school. I grew up in an incredibly white part of the country in Connecticut. And having to interface every day with a really intelligent, awesome person of Hispanic background changed what I thought was possible because I just didn't have that opportunity before. And so, Mr. Carreras, you were an awesome teacher. I was always really tired when I met you, but also was just really happy to have known you. And I hope you're doing well wherever you are. Thank you, Mr. Carreras. Brian, who is your spotlight today?
I was just going to shout out Don Foster at the Chaos Project. I got a chance to meet Don at State of OpenCon in the UK, very briefly at the table, and had been following the Chaos Project for quite a few years. They had just recently joined the project. They threw together a chaos.community/about chaos practitioner guides, which I hopefully will be in the show notes because that's a longer URL. Went through a bunch of the Chaos Project metrics and distilled them into like, here are best practices on how to even know what you're looking at when you look at these metrics. So things like contributor absence or elephant factor. How do you have a story that can come out of that? I think that's one of the hardest part about just throwing metrics and counting PRs and issues and companies is there's no actionable insight, and they're doing a great job for this. So we're inspired and trying to build parts of that in our product. But just wanted to shout out, started there, Chaos Community and Don Foster.
Don is amazing. We recently had Don on the podcast, but I'm seeing that it hasn't been uploaded yet. So get ready to listen to another podcast with Don Foster about the practitioner guides that Chaos has made. It will be here. It will be live. It will be awesome. Don Foster is amazing. Listeners, I hope you've enjoyed this podcast. If you have, there are a few things that you can do. One, you can like the podcast wherever you're listening to it, Apple, Spotify, wherever. Two, you can go to podcast.sustainoss.org and look at the show notes. You can find a lot of links from this episode. I've tried to throw as many as I could in. So go check out the show notes that are made by Deanne and Paul Barr, who are amazing. Hi, Paul. Hi, Deanne. You are awesome. You can also donate to this podcast if you're interested. Go to opencollective.com/sustainoss. Donations equals love. You can also send us notes and comments by emailing podcast@sustainoss.org. And really, you should go on the show notes anyway, because you're going to want to reach out to B. Dougie and say, thank you, or I want to sign up, or I want to get involved, or I want to throw you a Series A. Where can I put my money? So do check out for that. Go to opensauce.pizza. Brian, thank you so much for coming on. I hope the project goes really well. Keep us updated on it. This is awesome. And yeah, I'm just grateful. And thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.